we have got a special episode today. This is Are You a Robot podcast and videocast. And if you don't know what we're doing here, this is a place where we can get together and address some of the greatest challenges that we have stemming from AI and other related technologies. The way that we're doing this is we get together a bunch of really smart minds and ask them questions, ask them to tell us about what they're doing in their respective fields and how we can tackle some of these big issues surrounding AI governance and AI ethics. We're trying to stimulate conversation and create best practices for the community as we move forward and AI becomes more and more a part of our daily lives. To do that, we've created a Slack workspace. Feel free to jump in it because we would love to have your voice. We'd love to know what you're working on, how you feel about things. You can find all the links to that down below in the description. And last but not least, I will say a few words about our sponsor. None of this would be possible if it weren't for EthicsGrade, the ESG benchmarking firm that is specifically focused on technological governance. Thank you to them. Feel free to check them out. The links are down below in the description also. Without further ado, well, actually, we do have further ado. So today we talked with Emily Wenger, and she is just an incredible person. What she's doing, what she's working on right now is so spectacular and really humbling. For those who don't know who she is currently a PhD candidate at the University of Chicago. She's a math lover through and through. She says it right away when we get into the podcast. But what she's doing at the University of Chicago, which is so interesting, is her work with the Fawkes team. And the Fawkes team is creating a defense mechanism against facial recognition, AI facial recognition. So some of the things that we dive into is where is this moral line? Where is the code here? Because you are creating a facial recognition deterrent, but what about those times when we actually do need facial recognition? She answers everything so eloquently. I'm just going to let her get into it. And without further ado, let's talk with Emily Wenger.
Are you a robot?
So, hello, Emily. Thank you for joining us today.
Happy to be here. It's an exciting time.
Yeah. So you've been doing some really cool stuff, and I want to talk a lot about these different papers that you've written and everything around what is going on with this facial detection and how we can go into the ethics issues of that. But before we jump into anything, I just wanted to ask quickly, how did you get into tech and more specifically this machine learning path?
Yeah, it's been a winding road for sure. It started because as a kid, I just really loved math. It was something that always made sense to me and I just liked it. I never thought about it as a career, but when I was thinking about college, I realized that I would be kind of unhappy if I didn't do math. So I just kept going. I studied math and physics in my undergrad and then graduated and worked for the government for a little while doing more math. And eventually all of these different paths led me to a PhD in machine learning because I knew that the thing I liked most about math was that it could help people understand the world better. That's why I liked physics. It provided models and context for a phenomenon that you see in real life. And I think machine learning does the same thing for bigger problems in different, less understood areas like society. And that's been kind of the driving force of I like math because it makes sense to me, and I like math because it explains the world. And that's, I think, how I ended up here.
Nice. Yeah, so it's tends to be the path for the mathematicians, right? When you get real statistical and then you get into data science and then you start seeing, oh, I can do some cool stuff with this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I'm wondering what your motivating factors are for the work that you're doing right now with machine learning and AI, what is it that drives you?
Yeah. A lot, a lot of different things. But to pull on a few threads, I would say it's mostly trying to understand and correct what has been perhaps not well thought through or not well done in the rapid development of AI. So I think there's been a lot of enthusiasm around this technology, which is warranted. It's really interesting and really exciting. But I think there hasn't been a lot of sort of concomitant thought about what it would mean to do some of the things that have been done in the research world. So my research is largely focused on how can we push back against some of the imbalances that have been created through the proliferation of this technology. How can we empower consumers to protect their own privacy? How can we suss out like the vulnerabilities of this technology? That kind of thing.
And there's so much that I want to get into there with all of that. I think it's a super noble cause, first of all, like that there's so much that we don't even know has been taken away from us. And those that are on the front line, like yourself, that see how this different technology is being used and are looking at the implications and looking at ways that you can give back to the consumer, as you so very well put, I think is super important. And like going into the privacy issue, why is that such a big issue for you? Like what is something that is there that drives you in that?
I mean, it's something that impacts everyone. It's not just an esoteric mathematical theory. It's something that impacts my nephews and my grandparents and the people that I love. And that's really what drives me when I see that the decisions that tech companies or researchers are making are going to have negative consequences on people that I care about and the world in general. That's what motivates me to try and understand what's going wrong and push back.
And so can you just briefly, I guess we jumped ahead, we got a little excited there, but can you briefly explain the different projects that you're working on so those listeners have a better idea of what kind of cool stuff you're doing?
I would say most of my research centers on the idea of privacy and security in machine learning. So we're trying to look at these systems that are being deployed in government or industry and poke holes in the ways they're being used so that we can understand where the vulnerabilities are, where the privacy risks are. So in particular, one tool we made is called Fawkes. And that tool is designed to push back against the proliferation of facial recognition technology and some of its abuses. So Fawkes is designed to provide consumers with some sort of leverage to protect their own photos that they then post on social media sites. And the idea is that you use Fawkes, and if you apply Fawkes to your photos, then some big tech company can't come along and scrape those photos and use them to train a machine learning model that will recognize you without your consent.
And just a quick follow-up on that, how is Fawkes used for your photos? Is it like an app that I run my photos through, or is it something that I need to, like, how does that work?
There are a couple different instantiations of it. So we do have apps that we made for Mac and Windows. So those are pretty bare bones. We're not developers, so they don't look good, but they do the job. And then there's also like a command line interface if you're a little more technical and you want to get into some of the knobs and different buttons you can press to make Fawkes work in more subtle ways. There's that as well.
And so you mentioned that you feel like this facial recognition technology is being used or being abused by some. How do you see it being abused right now, and what is your take on that?
It's a thorny question. I think the ways in which I see it most risky are that it's being deployed in really important contexts, for example, like police use, without proper testing or understanding of how it performs on all individuals. So there's been a lot of talk about bias in facial recognition, so this is not a new line of thought, but the data sets that these models are trained on are not diverse. Like, they don't really cover everyone in the population. And as a result, like, these models don't understand what people who aren't functionally white look like. So they don't perform well on those kinds of people. And if you're going to deploy these systems in a broad context in a way that's designed to impact and, interface with everyone, you have to make sure your system works on everyone, That's one small example. There are other, well, maybe it's a big example. There are others as well, but that's kind of the one that really gets me sometimes. It's just so careless.
Yeah, and I think there is that tendency for us to think that, wow, there's this technology and it works. Let's apply it to as much as we can. And like, let's make robots automate things, and let's make facial recognition recognize people. And right now with machine learning, you know better than anyone, it's not at that stage where you can push it out on these big levels and have it be the source of truth, especially. And so that is such a great point to mention. And so now with Fawkes, what exactly does this do? It adds a drop, or how does it work with the photos?
Yeah.
I guess is my question.
So Fawkes relies on this understanding that models see images as numbers. They don't see them as the sort of shapes and colors that we look at. So because of that sort of very mechanical way of processing images, you can use the math to fool the models. So basically what Fawkes does is it takes your picture and it adds this mathematical filter on top of it that to the human eye doesn't change much at all, but to the model causes the underlying mathematical properties of the image to change so dramatically that if the model is trained on images with this dramatic distortion in its eyes, it won't actually recognize real pictures of you because they're mathematically so different from this cloaked training data that you've provided the model. So that's the idea. You put all these kinds of pictures on social media, and then if someone takes them, the model learns this distorted view of what you look like, and it won't recognize you in real life.
It's so fascinating. And there's so many roads that I want to go down on this. And the first one, I guess, is I remember talking to someone at a machine learning meetup, and they were saying that they are working with a fashion designer to create clothes that don't let models know that you're a human. And so I understand the applications of, yes, you don't want to let whoever it is know that. But then I also see the other side, which is if there are self-driving cars, which we know there are, and they're out there and they need to identify humans, and you're wearing clothes because you don't want to be identified, that causes a bit of a moral dilemma, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm just wondering, like, these issues where, yeah, you want to fight against this advancement, but you also want to be cognizant of some of it needs to happen, I guess. Is that something that goes through your mind?
Yeah. I mean, I certainly acknowledge that machine learning is helpful in certain spheres and is good. So yeah, of course, I don't want every system to be just broken by these various attacks, but I think there's far more hype pushing machine learning forward right now than there is sort of reticence to step back and understand, how can we consider some of the abuses that this also creates. So for the Fawkes example, right, like, yeah, there are probably legitimate uses of facial recognition technology, but the use case that Fawkes is trying to defend against is something like the company Clearview AI scraping social media photos without consent and then selling the model trained on those photos to people that you don't know about. And that's like an abuse of this technology, and that's what Fawkes is meant to defend against, is someone stealing your images and using them to train a machine learning model. Certainly a legally obtained and properly vetted model would have legitimate uses. But I would argue something like Clearview, especially given its stolen database of training images, probably is less legitimate.
Yeah, and that begs the question, what are some of these other illegitimate ways in your eyes of this being used? It's obvious that Clearview, and especially we don't even know that that's happening.
Yeah.
We're just going about our daily lives and somebody is taking our data without us knowing. But, well, a lot of people are probably taking our data without us knowing.
Frankly, everyone is taking our data. Yeah.
Yeah. So what are some other illegitimate ways in your eyes that this is being used, especially around facial recognition? And how do you foresee Fawkes helping?
That's a great question. The main thing that jumps to my mind is sort of the mass surveillance that happens in China, specifically like the persecution of the Uyghur minority group. There's a lot of different stories going around about how China's social credit system, and especially the facial recognition component of that, has been used to suppress and harm the Uyghur group in many ways. So I would say that's like one very, to me, powerful example of this technology being used illegitimately.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And there are so many, it's hard to see that when you have this technology that is potentially, it has lots of potential for moving us forward. And like I mentioned before, I remember the just the ability for us to be able to do good with it, right? And when it's used to not do that good, it is sad to see.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at, like, I'm just reminded of when, I think it was 2004, there was, when there are terrorist attacks, let's look at, and instantly, because of the surveillance that is around, you can get facial ID on people.
Yeah, like the Boston Marathon bombing, that was really important to catch the suspects.
Exactly. So then I'm just wondering, where's the line with, like, would Fawkes then not allow that to happen?
That's a great question. Yeah. So Fawkes is designed to protect you in a crowd. So it's designed to work best in the setting that I've previously described, where you have your images on social media, someone comes in, scrapes them along with a bunch of other people, and trains a model. Fawkes does not work as well when there is a smaller number of classes in the model that's being trained. So if someone's like specifically seeking to train a model that recognizes you, Fawkes doesn't work as well, simply because the lack of other classes to distract the model prevents this mathematical distortion from really fooling the model. So that's one setting. And then the other point is, like, you know, if the US government really, or any government really wanted to find someone, they could hire a private investigator and take pictures of them and train a model. You know, protecting your social media photos is one thing, but if someone really wants to find you, they have other means of doing so and tracking you down. So I would say Fawkes really would work best providing protection for the average citizen, but once you venture into the criminal world, there are a lot of factors that would make Fawkes not an impediment to those kinds of investigations.
Okay, great. So that's good to know, definitely. Because that was one of my main questions as I'm looking at this, like this, the battle between good and evil, right? And how this can be used for good, and it should be used for the average citizen, like you're saying, to protect themselves. But where is the line when it is someone that has bad intentions and they're also using it? And so
it's so
thanks
tricky.
for breaking it down.
Yeah. It's so tricky. And that's something that's like, I'm not jaded about it yet, but it is certainly like a little bit disconcerting to look at every piece of research I produce and think like, oh, there is an illegitimate use to this technology. And like, you can mitigate those risks, you can provide sort of caveats, but it is unfortunate that basically everything is corruptible in some way.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the scary part. And so I'm wondering, like, all of the research that you're doing, with that being said, do you foresee regulation coming in and trying to stop you from doing this? Like maybe government or what did you say earlier? Clearbit AI
Clearview.
or
Yeah,
Clearview? Are they
Clearview.ai.
gonna are they gonna try and silence this by paying off some governor or senators?
Well, luckily, the tide of media attention is against places like Clearview right now. They just got sued by the state of Illinois and had to totally remove their operations from here. I don't know. I mean, on the plus side, right now, both like popular opinion and it seems most government opinion, policy opinion, is on the side of tamping down the abuses of big tech and thinking more thoughtfully about facial recognition. So I'm hopeful that the regulation will fall on the side of let's step back from this technology. Let's think about this technology. But who knows? Maybe someday the tide of public opinion will turn and we'll be seen as the bad guys. But I hope that doesn't happen for a long time or ever.
And so as you see machine learning moving forward and these uses being applied to so many different situations, and you're seeing the potential for wrong in these situations, what do you feel needs to be done? And how do you feel this can be slowed?
I think every PhD student, master's student, undergraduate student who wants to be a machine learning developer or a software engineer should take a series of ethics courses in teaching them how to think carefully and considerately about what they are designing. Because I think maybe there are a lot of different professions that have at times had a really broad influence on society. And right now it's software. And if these people are reshaping our world through these very seemingly innocuous code decisions, they need to be thoughtful about it. And I would say that's one line of a perhaps much broader approach that can be used to rein in these abuses and thoughtlessness.
Such a good point. And so then there is that ethics in their mind. They understand, well, maybe this might not be the best project to embark on, or if someone wants me to do this at my job, maybe it's not the best thing that I could make use of my time for.
Yeah,
So,
I follow these, like, I read new papers that come out every day, and if they catch my eye, I like read the abstract. And the number of papers that come out about, improving emotion recognition or improving voice, like cloning and synthesis, that have no statement about, here's maybe an ethical consideration of this thing we're creating. It's kind of astounding, like the lack of thought that goes into the other side of the creation of these technologies.
yeah, that is fascinating to think about how that is. It might be the most important piece, and it's not even mentioned at all in these papers. So that is not the best thing to think about or harp on.
Yeah.
But this is something that your work is definitely trying to do and you're trying to put forward. How else do you feel you can be like putting forth more of this and trying to kind of rally the community around, like you said, these PhD students so that it becomes more of a standard practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that sort of speaks to my future career goals in many ways. There's only so much you can do as a PhD student, although I'll keep trying to produce research that is high quality and thoughtful and pushes back at these important questions. But, I would love to become a professor someday and have students who I challenge to think more deeply about their research, who then have students who challenge their students to think more deeply about their research. It's about building a community that thinks well about these issues and then asking that community to be bold in pressing back when they see these issues arise. So I don't have a very tangible plan. Right now, it's just me taking a lot of classes and having conversations, and my advisor's great at thinking about this too, and some students in my lab. But yeah, it's a growth area for everyone.
And where would you like to see, as you look forward, where would you like to see this whole field of machine learning and AI advance to in the next years, or potentially in the next 10 years, or, a couple decades?
That's a great question. I mean, I hope it continues. I think there is value in this work, and it will continue, I think, regardless of whether or not I want it to. I hope it continues, but I hope it is accompanied by just more thoughtfulness, that researchers don't pretend that they live in a bubble, and they don't deceive themselves into thinking that this esoteric problem they're researching won't have societal impact. And perhaps that will sort of create a more balanced approach to this whole thing.
Yeah, thoughtfulness is very important as we move forward. And like you said, the ethics on this also is huge. And I'm wondering, as we move forward, because I remember when I was at university, cameras, the little cameras that you would take everywhere, started to become a thing.
Yeah.
And they would be around at all the parties or when you went out. And it became the first time in my life when it always felt like I was in the background of a photo.
Yeah.
And I remember, because I grew up in Arizona, and people would say, "Oh yeah, I grew up in a little hippie town of Arizona," and people would tell me like, "Oh, when someone takes a picture of you, it takes a part of your soul," right? And so that was when cameras were first coming out. Now I really have never heard anyone say that for the longest time, because it's become so normal for us to just constantly be taking pictures, right? And you don't hear anyone saying, "Oh, well, it's taking a piece of your soul," or whatever this superstition is. And so what I'm wondering is, along these lines of facial recognition, if it is going to become so normalized for us that there is no longer that, like, should they be recognizing my face, or shouldn't they be? And I just wanted to know your thoughts on that.
You're right. It will probably happen that we'll adapt these technologies to the point that they're just part of life. Whether they should or shouldn't be is an interesting question. I don't know. Like, from a biometrics perspective, facial recognition is far more reliable. As, like, for example, Face ID is a much better, like, security measure than fingerprinting or something like that. So in that setting, I think, it would make sense to use facial recognition and to normalize it, because, again, there are bias issues that need to be corrected. But it is a more secure thing. But I don't know. I would hope that we're always a little skeptical of machines and of their ability to do things perfectly that humans themselves can't do perfectly. And that includes facial recognition, that includes self-driving cars. Like, the fantasy that humans can create perfect things is just that, a fantasy. And if we don't remain skeptical of our own abilities, then we're just going to be delusional.
And so how can we remain skeptical? What can we do? What are some things that we can do as these technologies come out?
That's a great question. I think one thing that keeps me skeptical of, for example, social media is just not being on it all the time, like intentionally removing myself from the sphere where it is, everywhere, and then stepping back in and reminding myself that it's bizarre that this technology exists, that is so, it creates these bubbles, and it's so just stilted. And I think I would hope that similarly, we as a society have spaces where we can step away and come back and, be reminded that it is strange that we live in a world where cameras can recognize our face. But I don't really know what that looks like in practice. It's only a dream, unfortunately.
Turning off the phone and going on a retreat.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe.
But that's like kind of a privileged thing to do. So I would hope that there's more accessible things as well. I'll have to think. I think that's a great question.
And so I think one thing that you spoke about is how our generation has lost its its ability to not be recognized, right?
Yes.
We've already been recognized so many times that no matter if I grow a beard or if I shave my head, Facebook still knows who I am, and they're still going to be able to, pick me out.
Yeah.
But you would like for more generations down the line to choose that anonymity. And I was wondering if you could speak on that a little bit more.
Yeah, no, I have no delusions that my data is scattered in a million places around the internet, and my identity is identifiable in 1,000 different ways. And that's really disconcerting. And I don't want to be nihilistic, but also I don't think there's a way that with technology I create right now, I can sort of rein in that loss. But I do think that we have an amazing opportunity as a new generation is born, and as kids are born into a society that will never be without the internet unless, something crazy happens. And I think it's really important that we think not just about our privacy and safety, well, that is important, but about like the privacy and safety of those who are growing up in this ecosystem right now. Like Fawkes is one example of a tool that could be used to, as kids get on social media, to provide them with some recourse against, the scraping of their images and the creation of facial recognition systems that recognize them. And I think it's a really interesting line of thought and research, and it's one I'd like to explore more of like what proactive tools can we create right now that if someone were born now, that their life could be protected in a way that ours hasn't been because we have the benefit of hindsight. So that's the dream.
And I'm wondering if I just think about kids like younger kids on TikTok these days, and how you were talking about the China being one of these primary people who are using this facial recognition in the wrong way. And we all know who owns TikTok. And I'm just wondering how you would make it, like you said, there's so many different ways that they can identify you, not just with your facial recognition, but your voice or whatever it may be. And so these different, and I guess it would be something that would be native to a phone maker or whatever the technology is as we move forward. It would just be on there. And
yeah, we're trying to, I think there's two parts to this answer. One, yes, there can be a technical solution. We're working to do something with Fawkes for the voice domain. So just like you can sort of distort your face, you could distort your voice so that no one can train a voice recognition system that recognizes you. So that's something that I'm excited about, and hopefully in the next couple of months we'll have some more results on. But I think it's a both and. Like you can't have technical solutions without also policy and advocacy and education. And the combination of those things, I think, would be the most powerful set of weapons to fight back against this sort of thing.
And the policy and advocacy, like, how do you see that playing out? Is that something that comes from the government level, that they say, hey, look, we need this to happen, or we need the facial recognition to stop? Like, how do you see that playing out?
I think it needs to come from all levels of society. I mean, yes, there's a role for government, absolutely, because they have the clout and the authority to stop illegal action or declare action illegal that is harmful in terms of facial recognition technology or other technologies. I also think it needs to be a parental thing and a school level thing of, we teach health in schools. Why can't we also teach like digital privacy? And because that is just as much a part of a kid's experience these days as is, sports or any other extracurricular. And obviously, like, parents have a responsibility to their kids to keep them safe and to teach them about the world. And like, that is something that needs to happen at that level as well. So I think it's every system needs to work to think about this problem, and the combined result hopefully can be a safer world for kids.
And so the way that I see what you're doing with Fawkes is like the the first iteration, right?
Yes.
And I imagine that there are going to be people that aren't going to like the fact that you're doing this. And so they're going to try to create something that counters that. Have you seen that happening already, or do you suspect that will happen shortly?
Yeah, I haven't seen it happening already. Most of the pushback we've seen on Fawkes has been more of the ilk of, well, this is silly. Why are you trying to protect something that has already been lost? Less so than like, I'm gonna fight you and I'm gonna develop a technology that can thwart this. But I'm sure there are people thinking about that, and as those things emerge, we'll hopefully develop techniques to thwart that. The thing about security research is it's always a cat and mouse game, unfortunately. You develop something, they fight back, and you hope that the solutions you develop iterate you towards a better final one, but it's hard to know when you've reached it.
Yeah, I mean, that was my next question in a way, was like, I know you all are a smart group of people that are working on Fawkes, and there's a handful of you.
Yeah.
And then I think about Facebook or TikTok and how many people, machine learning engineers they have. And if they were tasked with this problem of, oh, hey, something's happening to our algorithms and they're not detecting faces, go fix it or find out what it is. I just wonder how long it would be before they had a solution to Fawkes.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, like from a technical perspective, I do think Fawkes could be hard to detect, given that it's kind of a non-deterministic algorithm, so it'd be hard for them to reverse engineer what's going on. But I also think, looping back to an earlier point in our conversation, that's where this call for like ethics education for machine learning engineers comes back. Like, if you're working for Facebook and they're asking you to do something that's like violating people's privacy, I would hope that you would think twice about that action. If not now, then maybe in the future when there's more widely available education to inform people about those issues.
Yeah, and that's what comes back to exactly your point, like where you're getting more pushback is, why are you doing this with something that's already been lost? And so I think about an engineer working at Facebook, and they are tasked with figuring out, why is this not picking up these faces? And for them, ethically, I foresee it being really hard for them to say, well, actually, we shouldn't do this.
Yeah.
Because they've been doing it for so long. It's already been happening. So how are they now going to take a stand?
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing our society is really bad at is giving grace to people who come out and say, I was wrong, who publicly change their stance on something. I think we're far more willing to just punish them for holding their old opinion than celebrate them for changing their mind. And I would hope that we could be better about that. When people realize that perhaps their work has been harmful and they change their mind, let's encourage them in that and celebrate that, rather than just shaming them for holding something incorrectly in the past. And maybe that culture shift could help these kinds of changes of mindset be easier, because you're no longer afraid of what people will tell you if you change your mind.
And so we kind of touched on it already, but I'd love to know what other ways you feel are there for machine learning to abuse our privacy.
So there's a lot of them. I mean, it's privacy is one thing. I think privacy speaks to the issue of like how data is obtained and how it is used. And there are, a lot of different companies that track you online without your consent and take that data and use it to feed advertising algorithms or credit score algorithms or facial recognition technology. And that's a problem, for sure. But there's also an issue of equity in that, not only are these models relying on data that they maybe shouldn't have access to, but often these models make incorrect assumptions about who you are because of competing factors such as socioeconomic status that get encoded into the way they make their decisions. So there's a whole host of issues, and I could give specifics, but it's also very broad.
I'd love to hear a few use cases, and then I'd also love to hear what you feel are the most important. And obviously for you right now, Fawkes is one of the biggest things I would imagine that you have in your life. You're working on it, and you're making sure that it is a successful project. And so I understand that facial recognition is probably for you a huge factor in all of this. But I'd also love to hear what other pieces you feel really passionate about.
Yeah. There's basically any algorithm that ends up in government or in criminal prosecution, I find myself kind of worked up about sometimes. Like there's a sentencing algorithm that can sometimes be used to decide, how long sentences are allocated for, that is often, it's been found, tends to make those sentencing decisions along factors that correlate with race. That's really concerning to me. That's really frightening, that we're just offloading the work of thinking about something to just an algorithm that does so imperfectly. Another one that really gets me are these college ranking algorithms that tend to use different sort of arbitrary factors to decide what are the best colleges, but often ignore cost as one of those factors. So essentially they ask colleges to do all these things to be considered best, but then they don't actually factor in affordability, which then makes, college less accessible for people whose life might be more substantially changed by that experience. So yeah, those are a few more tangible examples. But in general, just the side effects that are not often thought about in the creation of these algorithms are concerning.
Yeah, and that goes back to the education piece.
Yeah.
It's huge, right?
The education piece, and also that cultural humility, that we are willing to question ourselves, willing to step into the space of acknowledging that we are biased or imperfect or nearsighted, and being able to publicly change something that we previously took a strong stance on, whether it's an algorithm in a product or a personal opinion.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It echoes one of our other guests, Jason Lewis, who was talking about how we need to be able to look at the decisions we're making and look at really step back from the decision, because sometimes we think it's either A or B. We come to a Y in the road, and we think, well, it's either right or left. But his whole thing was talking about how we should look at why we feel we need to make this decision in the first place, and what it is that is driving us to get to this Y in the road. And so it's fascinating to think about that. Now, changing gears a little bit, I know in another paper that you've written, you talked about deep neural networks and honeypots that you've created with those.
Yeah.
And can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah. So this paper was, I'll back up. So there's a line of attacks that exists against neural networks called adversarial examples. They're similar in spirit to Fawkes in a way, in that you can take an image, say, of a dog, and tweak it slightly, and a neural network will classify it as a cat or a pigeon or whatever. So you can add these changes to images that are imperceptible, and they'll fool a model, because a model doesn't really look at an image. It only looks at the mathematical content of an image. So this honeypot paper was a defense we were creating to help defend models against those kinds of attacks. Because say you are a machine learning model in a self-driving car, and you're designed to classify speed limit signs or something, and someone has put one of these adversarial patterns on the sign, and you're fooled into thinking that's a stop sign or a yield sign. That's quite problematic, because you don't want a machine learning model to be fooled by these subtle perturbations. So the honeypot is something we embed. We train these weird nuances into the model such that if someone tries to construct one of these patterns or misclassifications against the model, you can easily detect it because it kind of falls right into our honeypot, and we can look in there and see, oh, look, this bad example is exactly where we would expect it to be if it were indeed bad. So we can use the internal workings of the model to suss out when a bad input is being presented to it.
And is this like trying to combat bad actors in that they would do things like attacks that you're talking about? Is this like hacking that would try to happen through this? I mean, you gave the autonomous car example, and I guess there are people maybe that want destruction from autonomous cars, and so they put stickers on stop signs and make it seem like a 60 mile an hour sign or something. But I'm wondering what other ways you saw this playing out.
One really interesting one is ad blockers. So there's a growth in the ad blocker movement where they're trying to use like neural networks to classify what is and isn't an ad and then block it. And if you're savvy enough, you can create an ad that can fool these neural networks because it has certain properties that sort of cause the neural network to misclassify it. So our defense could help these ad blockers better identify the content that's, being maliciously tweaked to evade them and prevent those ads from actually being shown. So that's another sort of use case of these defenses against adversarial attacks is, when people try to evade ad blockers.
And so do you see this being something that you could generalize and you could use it on many other use cases and I look at it like from what I understood from the paper is you could also tell when someone was trying to do this.
Yes.
So you could identify these bad actors and take action if necessary. And so I'm wondering, do you feel that would be something that you could generalize and you could start to see who was out there trying to attack different models?
Probably. It would depend on how savvy the adversary is, because if they're like querying a Google hosted model, they might use different accounts or something that would make it hard for us to establish a pattern of behavior. But yeah, in general, the idea of a defense that also can link a bad input back to a particular person would hopefully be something that could generalize and do more than just stop the attack from happening, but perhaps link it back to the attacker and do something more. That would be great. We'll see how that paper is adopted.
Yeah. So as we're coming down to the end of time, I want to ask just a few more questions. One is, as this war, we could say, maybe it's not a war, about staying private or not starts to play out, how in your mind do you see it like advancing? Are there things that you would like to definitely like make note of as we start to move forward?
This is weird, but I kind of see it in analogy to the automotive industry in some ways, like, and specifically like the safety of using cars, because, right now we're kind of making Model Ts and we're turning them off the production line. We don't totally understand what's going on, but we think it's cool and we're going to keep doing it. And I think the way I see it progressing is similar to, how we developed better cars that were safer, but that came through a combination of regulation and consumer activism. And even now, like the use and operation of cars it relies both on the consumer making correct decisions and following, laws and having common sense, and automakers, being thoughtful and careful about how they design their product. And I would hope that the war on privacy progresses similarly, where there's a lot of different forces at play. both consumers in articulating like what actually privacy means to them and developing a better sense of what it is we're actually trying to protect, because that's such a broad term. And, model makers and legislators developing reasonable, thoughtful measures that respond to consumer needs and protect them as the system continues to evolve. So I have no illusion that it's going to be perfect and that we're going to have just perfect privacy, although that in itself is like an undefinable term. But I think if it is a conversation and it is something that progresses with a lot of care, hopefully we can reach a point where more people are protected and more people are satisfied than exists right now.
Yeah, and that's such an interesting point, how you talk about people will have to do their part also, right?
Mm-hmm.
Using their common sense, using what they know, like when we're driving cars and we follow the rules of the road.
Yeah.
And we know that these are things we can do with the car and these are things we shouldn't do. And
Mm-hmm.
and if we do them, we're the ones putting ourselves at risk.
Yeah. Yeah. There is a point where consumer common sense has to enter the arena. Like, we can't put the load of privacy entirely on the backs of companies because A, they don't always have consumers' best interest at heart, and B, like, we have skin in this game too.
That's a fascinating point. I like that. So the last question I have for you, Emily, is, are you a robot?
No, I'm real.
Oh, perfect. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate talking to you. I love hearing your vision of things, and I hope that we can chat again in a little bit. Maybe you can tell us about the new things, the new advancements of Fawkes, or whatever it is that you will be working on next, because I'm sure it will not disappoint.
Thank you so much. It's been great talking to you.
All right. Cheers. Have a great day.
Thank you.